Welcome, dear listener, to this quiet corner of history and mystery. Thank you for joining me tonight, where we'll journey slowly through stories that whisper from the past. Stories meant to calm your mind and ease you into restful sleep. Here, time moves gently, and every word is a soft step toward peace. So settle in, relax, and let the world fade away as we begin our story together. It is in the nature of quiet things to linger, like the hushed rustle of leaves in still forest, or the soft creak of old wood settling beneath the weight of memory. Beliefs, especially those born in shadows and whispered under breath, move like this too, subtle, nearly imperceptible, creeping not through loud proclamations or obvious declarations, but seeping gently through generations, passed from tongue to ear in lullabies that warn, in glances that avoid, in the almost forgotten customs that no one truly questions anymore. And among the many beliefs that have drifted through time, coiling softly through cultures, is a persistent and peculiar idea that mirrors, those silent, gleaming panels of glass and metal, might hold within the ability to do more than just reflect what stands before them. That perhaps, beneath their smooth surface, there lies a kind of hunger, a quiet appetite for something more than image alone. That perhaps, when one stands too long in their gaze, something essential, something irreplaceable, might be drawn out and trapped within. That perhaps a mirror could steal your soul. There is something undeniably unsettling about your own reflection when observed too long in silence. Most have felt it, though few speak of it. It begins innocuously enough. A glance into a mirror late at night, perhaps, when the world is still and all the noises that might have distracted the mind have hushed. You look, first just to check your face or adjust your hair, but then, as the quiet deepens and your eyes adjust to the soft lighting, you find yourself gazing longer than you intended. You notice details you usually overlook. The way one eyebrow arches more than the other. How your eyes seem almost like someone else's when seen from that angle, or how the corners of your mouth rest in an expression you don't consciously recognize. And then comes a strange moment. The flicker of suspicion that the person in the mirror is not entirely you. That maybe, just maybe, there's something behind those eyes that isn't entirely yours. And you look away, just to break the spell. You always do. Long before science offered answers and logic calmed the easily spooked mind, people trusted their instincts more purely. They did not need proof to feel fear, nor studies to believe what their bones already knew. To them, mirrors were not mundane household objects, but mysterious things, portals of sorts, thresholds between the known and the unknown. And while a modern observer might dismiss such superstition with a casual shrug, those who lived in earlier centuries would not be so quick to mock. For to them, the world was not divided so clearly between reality and the imagined. Spirits lived among them, unseen but powerful. The dead did not always stay gone. Shadows could be more than the absence of light. And a mirror, cold, gleaming, and eerily still, could not simply be trusted. The idea that a mirror might possess a kind of power is not, after all, entirely illogical when viewed to the lens of human instinct. What else in the ancient world could so perfectly mimic a person's face? What else could hold your gaze and reflect it back at you, unblinking, yet utterly mute? In a world where most materials were rough, dull, and shaped by hand, the mirror's surface was uncanny. Too smooth, too precise, too flawless. It did not belong. It seemed instead like a thing of the other world, sent here to imitate and observe. And imitation, as many cultures would come to fear, is a dangerous form of magic. The fear that one's soul might be stolen through the act of reflection, through a mirror or even still water, has been whispered in too many corners of the world for it to be easily dismissed as coincidence. From the Amazonian basin to the icy steppes of Siberia, from the deserts of North Africa to the misty coasts of the British Isles, people have long approached their own reflections with a mix of fascination and dread. Some believe the soul was a thing of breath, others of fire, others still of shadow or song, but many agreed on one unsettling point, that it could be separated from the body, and that certain objects imbued with mystery might be capable of taking it. It is worth noting that fear of the mirror is not just about vanity or surface unease. It is a deeper, more profound discomfort, for to see oneself perfectly is to face the self without distortion, and that can be a terrifying proposition. In daily life, most people move about with only an internal idea of who they are, guided by feeling, thought, and memory. But a mirror shows no mercy. It offers a cold, external truth, one that strips away illusion and familiarity. It shows not what you believe yourself to be, but what the world sees. The curve of your spine, the tiredness under your eyes, the way your expression falls when you are not smiling. There is something soul-bearing in that clarity. And for many ancient people, that vulnerability felt like exposure, like danger, like an invitation for something to enter or something to leave. And so, quietly and cautiously, mirror superstitions began to form. These beliefs were rarely codified into formal doctrine, but instead took shape in ritual and repetition. A mirror must be covered when someone dies, lest the departing soul be confused and become trapped. A child must not gaze into a mirror until they are older, lest their young spirit be pulled away. Mirrors should not be kept in bedrooms, for in sleep one is most vulnerable. One must never look into a mirror in candlelight alone. One must never speak a name while staring into a reflection. One must never let a mirror face another, for the reflections will bounce endlessly, creating a portal that cannot be closed. These rules were passed from mother to daughter, whispered by village elders, sometimes half-remembered, but always respected, because no one, no matter how skeptical, wanted to take the risk. Perhaps it was never about certainty. Perhaps the belief that mirrors could steal the soul was never born from knowledge, but from a deep, old caution, an instinct that told us that when something looks like us but is not us, we should not trust it. That when a surface offers back our face with such precision, it might be doing more than just showing. It might be watching. It might be listening. It might be waiting. And as that belief settled into the corners of history, unnoticed by the thundering march of progress, it began its quiet drift across oceans and over centuries, carried by stories, by customs, by dreams half remembered in the morning light. And so we begin our journey into the ancient world, where the first mirrors were not made of glass at all, but of something more primal, more earthly, and, to the people who used them, far more magical. It was there in the days before history was written down that humans first caught sight of themselves not in polished silver or fine crystal, but in something older still, in still water, dark and deep, and full of secrets yet to be named. Long before the first gleam of polished metal or the whispering shimmer of blown glass ever met the eye of humankind, there was water, quiet, still, dark, and unknowably deep. It collected in the hollows of the earth like secrets pooling in forgotten places, gathered in stone basins carved by rain, in the calm curves of rivers where wind dared not stir, and in lakes where the sky seemed to press its face down upon the surface in silence. There, long before language had found its shape and long before any word for mirror had been formed in the mouths of our ancestors, people stood, alone or in clusters, and stared into their own reflections as though glimpsing something not fully understood. And in those lingering moments, beneath skies lit only by moon and flame, something ancient awakened in them. Not knowledge, not yet, but feeling, an emotion without a name, shaped only by the weight of their breath and the strangeness of the things staring back at them. The earliest humans knew the earth not as background or stage, but as a living, breathing entity, an immense and sacred being that spoke in silence and signs. Every rustle, every shadow, every sudden coldness was a message, if one only knew how to read it. And so, when they saw themselves staring back from a still surface of water, eyes meeting eyes, gesture mirroring gesture, they did not greet this with scientific curiosity. Instead, they were overcome with something far older than reason, awe and a creeping sense of unease. For they understood instinctively that to see oneself in such a perfect, motionless way was not natural. It felt like magic, or worse, like a trick. The reflection offered no voice, no scent, no warmth. It echoed motion, but not life. It could not be touched, and yet there it was, floating just beneath the surface, like a ghost, like a twin, like a shadow given form. And because these early humans lived lives defined by survival, surrounded by danger seen and unseen, they knew better than to trust things that mimic life too well. In their understanding of the world, shaped by rituals, dreams, and a constant conversation with death, anything that could imitate a person without being one was likely to be dangerous, likely to be a spirit, or a thief, or a sign, and so they began to avoid certain pools at dusk. They refused to look into still water on nights when the moon was full. They taught their children to splash the surface before peering in, so the spell might be broken and the soul remain safe. And around their fires at night, they began to whisper stories, not full narratives, but fragments of caution. A girl who stared too long into the lake and forgot her own name. A boy whose reflection lingered a heartbeat too long after he looked away. A hunter who saw not himself in the stream, but a face aged with death. These were not myths in the way we understand them now. They were warnings passed along like warmth from fire to fire. And in those warnings, the belief began to form that there was power in reflection, and that power was not necessarily kind. What the reflection could do, no one knew for sure. Some said it merely watched, others that it could steal parts of you, your memory, your thoughts, your dreams. But the most unsettling idea, the one repeated most often and in the quietest tones, was that the reflection could take your soul, that it didn't just show what you looked like, but somehow reach inside and pulled out the essence of who you were, trapping it just beneath the surface. That every time you gazed into water and blinked, a part of you blinked too, and that if you ever saw your reflection move when you did not, then you were already too late. The soul was gone, and the soul, though no two tribes defined it the same way, was always sacred. It was a thing that gave weight to a name, warmth to a voice, lightness to laughter. Without it, a person might still move and speak, but not truly live. And so, even in the absence of shared language or written belief, many early peoples came to the same conclusion. One must be careful around one's reflection. It was not to be taken lightly. It was not to be treated as play. Children especially were watched with vigilance near water, not just for fear of drowning, but for fear of something else, something harder to name, something that waited in the surface, just out of reach. Some of the oldest carvings ever found, etched into cave walls in France, Australia, and South Africa, depict figures not only of animals and hunts, but of people gazing into curved shapes. Shape scholars have long debated. Some say they are moons or shields or symbols of fertility, but others suggest something simpler and stranger, that they may represent pools of water, and that the people drawn beside them are not simply looking but confronting themselves. It is a theory difficult to prove, but compelling nonetheless. For why else, in the heart of darkness, would one draw such scenes unless they held meaning beyond the literal? Why else record a moment of looking, unless what was seen carried power? Even more telling are the burial practices found near some of these sites. In a few rare graves, early humans were buried not with tools or ornaments, but with smooth stones placed over their faces. Stones polished to a sheen, as though meant to shield the dead from being seen, or from seeing, or perhaps, more ominously, from being reflected. It is impossible to know what exact meaning those stones held for the people who placed them there, but it speaks again to that unshakable feeling, that belief lurking at the edges of language, that something dangerous lives in reflection, that it must be blocked or buried or hidden away. Over time, as the centuries slipped by like water under ice, the materials changed, and so did the rituals. As tools grew sharper and minds more inventive, people learned to polish stone, to burnish bronze, to coax reflections out of metal. But even then, the superstition endured. The belief had taken root, buried so deep it could survive even as civilizations rose and fell. Because the fear was never about the material. It was about the act of seeing oneself truly and wholly in something that did not breathe, in something that might be watching back. And so, from the misty banks of prehistoric rivers to the quiet hollows of tribal lakes, from the soot-darkened caves to the firelit stories whispered under hides and stars, the idea grew stronger, that reflection was not harmless, not ever, that it could take from you something more precious than blood or breath, that mirrors, even if not yet called mirrors, were never simple things. It would not be long before humans began to craft their own reflections more deliberately, shaping polished surfaces that could be carried and controlled. But the fear would follow them still. For even as the face grew clearer in the metal's gleam, the question remained, what exactly is looking back? As the slow turning of ages carried humanity from the scattered fires of nomadic clans to the structured rhythms of cities and stone, the world itself seemed to solidify. The once wandering spirits of nature were named and worshipped in temples. The chaos of weather and beast was mapped into calendars and rituals. People, no longer merely survivors, became builders, scribes, and priests. In the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the rivers moved like living veins to the body of Mesopotamia, some of the first great cities rose: Uruk, Lagash, Eridu. And within their sun-baked walls, something remarkable happened. The reflection was no longer found only in water. It was summoned from the earth, shaped by fire and captured in metal. Here, amid the hum of life in the world's first known civilizations, humans began to craft mirrors. These early mirrors were not the silver-backed sheets of later ages, nor the gleaming glass we now glance into without thought. They were shaped from polished obsidian, from volcanic glass, and eventually from burnished bronze, pounded and smoothed until the surface shimmered enough to catch a likeness. They were small, often no larger than the hand, and curved slightly inward like the memory of a bowl that once held offerings. But despite their size, they held a significance far beyond their form. For to hold such a mirror was to hold oneself outside the body. It was to grasp a ghost, to cradle a twin made of light and metal. And to many, this was not a gesture of vanity. It was a gesture of profound spiritual danger. In Sumerian myth, the soul was not a simple thing. It was layered, complex, and fragile, composed of breath and thought and essence. It could be stolen, shattered, weighed, or banished. It could walk in dreams, hide in shadows, or hover over the body for days after death. And as these people peered into the gleam of bronze, they began to suspect that such surfaces might touch the soul in ways no hand could. Some believed that mirrors held the breath of the gods, a sacred imitation of the divine act of creation. Others feared they might serve as traps, prisons for spirit, a shiny net that snared the self. And because these fears were not written plainly, but whispered through ritual, through omission, and through the careful placement of mirrors in death, they became even harder to untangle, even more embedded in the quiet folds of belief. Mirrors were often placed in graves, buried beside the dead, not as tools of the living, but as offerings or perhaps safeguards. It is easy to imagine the logic. The soul, upon leaving the body, would see its own face in the polished metal and, for a moment, be caught. It would linger, confused, looking back at itself as if through a window. And perhaps that pause gave the priest time to speak the right words, to guide it away. Or perhaps the mirror itself served as a door, a final passage through which the soul could step. Whatever the intent, the placement of mirrors with the dead was not casual. It was deliberate. It was solemn. It was laced with meaning deeper than the surface could reveal. In temples, mirrors were used not for grooming, but for divination. Priests might gaze into them not to see themselves, but catch glimpses of the future, or of distant places, or the gods' desires. The mirror became a sacred instrument, its surface a veil between worlds. And the one who looked into it did so with caution, for reflection, now a controlled act, was no less mysterious. If anything, it had become more dangerous, because now it could be summoned at will, no longer just found by accident in water or glass. One could look into a mirror and call forth the self at any time, and that made it a thing of power. And power, in the ancient world, was never free. There were rules, of course, silent ones, but strict nonetheless. One must never look too long. One must never gaze into a mirror while ill or grieving, lest the soul be tempted to leave. Mirrors must be turned downward during storms. They must be wrapped in cloth during certain phases of the moon. And if a mirror fell and cracked, it was not only broken, it was cursed. A split reflection was a split self, and a soul seen in fragments might not know how to return whole. These ideas were not written in the cuneiform tablets that recorded grain counts and kingly deeds. They lived elsewhere, in the rituals of women preparing the dead, in the careful way a mirror was passed from hand to hand, in the nervous laughter of children forbidden to touch what gleamed too brightly. And perhaps what was most unsettling of all was the silence of the reflection. For all the wonders of early civilization, the ziggurat stretching toward the sun, the intricate patterns carved into stone, the voices of scribes capturing time itself, nothing disturbed the heart quite like the stillness of a face in bronze. It did not change. It did not age. It offered no explanation. It simply waited. And in that waiting, people saw a truth they could not name, that the self, once seen too clearly, becomes strange, becomes other, becomes something to be feared. It was during this age, too, that artists began to depict mirrors in their carvings and etchings held by goddesses, stared into by spirits. In these depictions, the mirror is not merely an object. It is an actor, a presence, and those who use it are never smiling. Their eyes are wide, their mouths closed, as if bracing for something to emerge from the surface, or perhaps fearing what might vanish into it. And yet, despite the fear, or perhaps because of it, mirrors endured. They were passed down, wrapped in cloth and sealed in urns. They were hidden in walls, placed in tombs, held close to the chest like talismans. Because even as people feared them, they could not let them go. For what is more human than the need to see oneself, even when it frightens us, even when we believe the act itself might steal a piece of us away? So the people of ancient Mesopotamia continued to shape mirrors, to polish and peer and wonder. And as their cities rose and fell, as their stories etched themselves into bones of history, the belief lived on, carried by merchants and wanderers, by brides and mourners, by those who looked into a mirror once too often and felt somehow less afterward. It was a belief that would not die, even as the Bronze Age and the names of cities were lost to dust. Instead, it traveled westward, eastward, until it reached the lands of the pharaohs, where the sun burned gold and death was only the beginning. There, among the tombs and temples of Egypt, the mirror would take on new meaning. It would become both tool and threshold, both light and loss. And there, too, the soul would shimmer upon the surface, ready to be seen, or stolen. In the land where the Nile wound like a sacred thread to the tapestry of life and time, where papyrus swayed in the warm breeze and temples loomed like sentinels of stone against the horizon, reflection did not merely mean vanity, nor curiosity, nor even superstition. It meant eternity. For the ancient Egyptians, who lived not in fear of death but in elaborate preparation for it, the world of mirrors was not a world apart, but one intimately connected to the realm of gods, spirits, and the departed. The mirror, so carefully shaped and reverently used, was more than a possession. It was a promise. It was a doorway. These mirrors, often made of bronze or copper and polished to a radiant gleam, were designed not simply to reflect a living face, but to offer a glimpse of the immortal soul. Unlike the darker, moodier obsidian mirrors used by other early cultures, the Egyptian mirror was luminous, reflecting sunlight and the gold of day, capturing the glow of Ra himself. Yet despite their brilliance, they were never treated as idle ornaments. No one in ancient Egypt looked into a mirror casually, just as no one entered a tomb without reverence. There was a weight to the reflection, a gravity that pulled the viewer closer not only to their own image, but to the greater mystery of what lay beyond it. To the Egyptians, the soul was not a singular thing. It was a constellation of elements, each one vital, each one at risk of separation. There was the Ka, the life force that remained near the body, the Ba, the spirit that could fly between worlds, the Ak, the transfigured soul that lived on in the afterlife. There were names and shadows, hearts and breath, all part of the intricate weave that made a person whole. And the mirror, silent, gleaming, unblinking, was said to reveal not just the surface of a person, but the state of these inner parts. If one looked into it with clarity and calm, perhaps they would see all was well. But if the image wavered or darkened or moved when the body stood still, it was taken as a sign. Something within was lost, stolen, or waiting to be judged. It is no coincidence that mirrors were often found among the grave goods placed in tombs, nestled carefully beside jewelry and amulets, their surfaces polished smooth even in death. These were not tools for the journey to the afterlife. They were companions. For just as a boat might carry the soul across the celestial river, a mirror might help the spirit find itself again on the other side. It might reflect not the face of the dead, but their Ba, winged and searching, or their Ka, standing in quiet vigil. The mirror could help the soul remember what it once was and guide it toward what it must become. In rituals, too, the mirror played its part. Temple priestesses, often associated with Hathor, the goddess of beauty, joy, and the afterlife, would use mirrors as part of their sacred duties. The mirror was not only a symbol of the goddess herself, but a channel through which divine energy could be reflected and received. To gaze into a mirror under the guidance of a priestess was to invite Hathor's blessing, her grace, her protection, but it also meant facing whatever in oneself was unworthy. For no goddess, no matter how kind, could bless what was hidden in shadow. The mirror revealed, and in revealing it purified or condemned. There are stories buried in the fragments of funerary texts and hinted at in the Book of the Dead, of spirits caught in confusion after death, unable to find their way to the field of reeds, that lush and eternal paradise where the worthy walked forever in peace. Some said these souls had been corrupted in life, others that they had been buried without proper rites. But among the many whispered causes was this: the soul, upon leaving the body, saw itself in a mirror and did not recognize what it saw. It became lost in its own reflection, circling forever in that gleaming world, unable to escape. To prevent this, mirrors were sometimes turned to a wall during certain funerary rites, their surfaces hidden until the spirit had safely passed beyond their grasp. Even in life, Egyptians took care in their interactions with mirrors. A mirror was never left uncovered in a room where someone slept, especially if that person was ill or pregnant. It was believed that the soul drifted during sleep, exploring other realms, visiting ancestors, receiving visions. If it passed by a mirror on its way, it might be caught or frightened or mistaken for a spirit by its own reflection. And if that happened, if the soul failed to return before the body awoke, it might mean death, or worse, waking without the fullness of self, a person hollow from within. Mirrors were also entwined with the practice of magical protection. Some mirrors were inscribed with protective spells or etched with the image of deities, often Hathor, Batet, or Isis, whose presence could guard the user from harm. These mirrors were not purely reflective. They were amulets, shields against dark forces. When gazing into them, the user was not only seeing themselves, but invoking a layer of divine watchfulness, a kind of sacred surveillance that warded off spirits who might otherwise pass through the reflection like a doorway. For just as some saw mirrors as shields, others saw them as gates. There were stories, too infrequently recorded to be formal doctrine, yet too persistent to ignore, that certain mirrors could be used to speak with the dead, that on the right night, with the right words, one might see not their own face, but the face of someone lost, a mother, a child, a king. These were not safe practices, nor commonly encouraged, for the dead were not always kind, and some had reasons to linger that were best left buried. Yet the temptation remained, and so too did the warnings. Never gaze too long. Never gaze alone. Never speak your own name in a mirror, for if the reflection speaks it back, it may not be you who answers. And so, in the golden halls of palaces and the cool, shadowed silence of tombs, mirrors remained, unmoving, waiting, absorbing the passing of time and the silent prayers of generations. They were placed in shrines and locked in chests, wrapped in linen and kissed by incense. They became heirlooms, passed through families like fragile spells, each one carrying the weight of what had been seen in its surface and what had not been forgotten. Even as Egypt fell under the rule of new empires, Greek, Roman, Arab, the mirrors endured. Their shapes changed. Their meanings were translated. But the reverence never vanished. For beneath every reflection was the same question, one that could never be fully answered. Is this truly me, or something watching through me? And from the great tombs of the pharaohs to the distant mountains of the east, that question would echo still. For in the land of the dragon and the jade moon, mirrors held a different kind of power, one even more bound by spirit, by reflection, and by fear. There, too, people believed that mirrors could trap more than light. They could hold the soul itself. In the folds of mountains where the mist clung low and the air was thick with incense, where bamboo whispered secrets to the wind and paper lanterns floated like drifting souls across darkened lakes, the mirror was not a simple object of the home, nor a lifeless sheet of brightness hung on the wall. It was alive with meaning, saturated with caution, and revered as an instrument both sacred and strange. In ancient China, a civilization as old and intricate as any the world has known, the mirror was a thing of power, not power in the earthly sense of wealth or weaponry, but in that deeper, older way, a quiet, watching, unblinking power that could both protect and devour, depending on how it was handled, and more importantly, how one looked into it. Here, more than in many cultures, The mirror was believed to possess a spiritual dimension, a reflective force capable not only of capturing the likeness of the living, but of revealing, hiding, or even ensnaring the spirits of the dead. One could trace the belief not only in tales, but in ritual, in folklore, in art, and in architecture itself. Mirrors, often of polished bronze with backs carved in detailed reliefs of dragons, phoenixes, or mythic beasts, were placed with deliberate care, not only in bedrooms or dressing spaces, but in tombs, temples, and altars. Their smooth surfaces shimmered like still water, and just as still water had long been believed to show the world beyond, so too did these mirrors hold the reputation of being windows to other realms. The ancients believed that mirrors had the power to repel evil. It was not a metaphor. It was a principle, one as accepted and respected as gravity or fire. Just as one knew to avoid touching flame, one knew that demons, malevolent spirits, and wandering ghosts could not bear to see themselves reflected. To face their own image was to be driven away, their dark essence turned upon itself, twisted by the purity of mirror truth. And so, mirrors were hung facing entrances, placed above doorways, mounted on the outer walls of houses, serving not decorative purpose but spiritual function, guarding the threshold of the home from forces that moved unseen through the night. These were called Yao Jing, demon-reflecting mirrors, and their presence was as essential to a household protection as fire to warmth or water to life. But there was more to it than repelling evil. Some mirrors were said to do the opposite, to trap. In stories whispered from one village to another, sometimes told around firelight when the air grew still and the moon climbed silently through the trees, people spoke of mirrors that could capture a spirit, just as one might trap a bird beneath a net. A ghost, wandering aimlessly, might find itself reflected in one of these mirrors, and upon seeing its own face, twisted by death, incomplete, searching, it might forget itself entirely and become caught, frozen in the metal, unable to return to the world it knew or continue into the one beyond. There were tales, too, of ancestors whose spirits lingered in mirrors voluntarily, not as punishment or misfortune, but as guardians. A woman might leave a mirror to her daughter with strict instructions never to let it crack, for her soul lived within, watching over the family from behind the gleaming surface. A mirror might be placed on an altar, wrapped in red silk save for special occasions, when incense would be burned and the cloth lifted, so the spirit might observe and be honored. And in those moments, the viewer did not look into the mirror to see themselves, but to let their ancestors see them. The act was not one of self-recognition, but one of offering. One stood before the mirror not as a person gazing into glass, but as a descendant presenting their life to the judgment and presence of the dead. Such mirrors were treated with the utmost care. They were not to be touched by children, not to be handled in times of mourning, not to be gazed into on certain nights, especially the seventh night after a death, when the spirit of the deceased was said to return home for one final visit. On that night, every mirror in the house was to be covered with cloth, lest the returning soul catch sight of its own reflection and become trapped in confusion, believing it had never left the realm of the living. The fear was not that the mirror would steal the soul maliciously, but that it would confuse it, catch it, hold in a kind of limbo, neither here nor there. There is a legend, centuries old, known in variations throughout different regions, of a cursed mirror that once belonged to a noble family. It was said that the woman of the house, upon learning of her husband's betrayal, died not of poison or blade, but of a broken heart. Her final breath exhaled before her image, which she had been staring into silently for hours. After her death, strange things began to happen. Servants reported whispers in empty rooms, a cold presence beside them when they dressed. Her daughters would wake in the night, weeping, unable to explain why. Finally, a monk was summoned, and upon seeing the mirror, he bowed his head in sorrow. "She is still inside," he said. She saw the truth and would not leave. They wrapped the mirror in silk, placed it in a lacquer box, and buried it deep beneath the earth. It is said that if the mirror is ever uncovered and polished, her face will be the first thing seen, waiting, unchanged by time. These stories were not merely for fright. They served to guide. They taught how to treat mirrors, how to fear them just enough, and how to respect their power. Because to look into a mirror in ancient China was never just about appearance. It was a spiritual act, one that invited reflection in every sense of the word. One was meant to consider not only how they looked, but who they were, what ghosts they carried, what ancestors watched them, what shadows moved behind the surface. And even in the realm of emperors, mirrors carried sacred weight. The legendary magic mirror of the Tang dynasty was said to reveal hidden symbols when light passed through it, images that could not be seen on the mirror's surface but appeared on the wall behind it when illuminated to the common folk. This was not a trick of metallurgy, but a sign that mirrors truly held secrets beneath their shine, secrets that only the wise or the worthy could glimpse. With time, these beliefs became enshrined in practice. Feng Shui masters included mirror placement in their calculations of harmony and balance. Mirrors were aligned not just for aesthetic, but to deflect negative energy, to channel luck, to avoid spiritual entrapment. And always, the warning remained: do not place mirrors across from beds. Do not allow your sleeping soul to drift into its own image and fail to return. So deeply embedded was this belief that even now, in modern apartments filled with screens and electric light, in cities where neon glows against the ancient eaves of temples, one may still find mirrors covered after death, or turn to face the wall during illness. It is a remnant, yes, but not a forgotten one. For behind every reflection is still the possibility, however quiet, however unlikely, that something more than light is being returned. That perhaps, in the silver calm of the surface, something waits, or watches. And as these beliefs traveled along the Silk Road, passed from tongue to tongue in the markets of Persia, India, and the Mediterranean, they began to change shape. But the fear remained. The idea endured, and would find a new voice in the minds of philosophers and poets on the other side of the world. In the white marble halls and echoing theaters of Greece and Rome, where the soul was reimagined once again, and the mirror became not just a vessel of the dead, but a symbol of the self. Beneath the endless blue of the Mediterranean sky, in cities where philosophers debated beneath olive trees, and poets wrote by oil lamp long into the night, the mirror ceased to be merely a charm or a threat, and became something more complicated, more personal, and perhaps even more dangerous in its own way. In the ancient worlds of Greece and Rome, the act of reflection was elevated into something philosophical, an exercise not merely of grooming or superstition, but of introspection, of searching, of knowing, and of fearing. Here, amid the teachings of Plato and the rituals of household gods, the mirror served a new purpose, not just to show the body, but to confront the self. And yet, even in this world of logic and inquiry, the old dread remained, softened by metaphor, disguised in allegory, but still very much alive. The Greeks, inheritors of Eastern wisdom and inventors of their own, regarded the soul, psyche, as something both divine and delicate, tethered loosely to the flesh and prone to wandering. It could be cultivated through virtue, shaped by thought, led astray by indulgence, or elevated by beauty. And beauty, above all, was considered both a gift and a curse. To see beauty in the world was to glimpse the divine, but to become obsessed with one's own beauty was to court disaster, to fall into that most Greek of downfalls, hubris. And what object encouraged that dangerous love of self more than the mirror? The story of Narcissus is, perhaps, the most famous echo of this fear. A boy, flawless in face and form, sees his reflection in a still pool and falls so deeply in love with it that he forgets hunger, thirst, and time. He stares transfixed until he dies, his spirit absorbed by the very image he loved. Though the tale is wrapped in myth, it speaks to something much older and more primal, that the reflection can be a trap, a snare for the soul, especially when the soul does not recognize the danger of being split between what is real and what is merely seen. To love one's reflection too much was to become lost in it, and to become lost in it was to die. And what is death, if not the final separation of body and soul? Plato, in his dialogues, warned of shadows and illusions. He wrote of prisoners in a cave, mistaking flickering shadows for reality, and when one finally escaped and saw the truth, light, form, real being, he could never return to the world of illusions again. Though he did not speak directly of mirrors in this famous allegory, the implication was clear. What we see may not be what truly is, and mistaking reflection for truth is a dangerous thing. The surface deceives. The soul, if it forgets this, is vulnerable. Mirrors, in this view, became both tools and threats, useful for those wise enough to understand their limitations, perilous for those who did not. The Romans, inheritors and imitators of Greek thought, brought mirrors into the daily rituals of life and death alike. Bronze and silver mirrors were common in wealthy households, polished to a bright gleam and often adorned with images of gods and goddesses on their reverse sides. Yet these mirrors were never entirely casual things. Roman religion was intensely domestic, centered around Lars and Penates, the household spirits, and Manes, the souls of the dead. It was believed that the dead lingered, that their presence filled a home, and that reflection could blur the line between living and spirit. This belief, though never codified, manifested in practice. Mirrors were often covered during mourning. Just as in Egypt and China, the reason was quietly understood. When a soul departs the body, it might linger near mirrors. It might see itself and remain confused, or worse, try to inhabit the body of the one reflected there. Even in death, the mirror played a role. Mirrors were placed in tombs, not for vanity, but for the soul's journey. To see oneself in the afterlife was thought to help the soul remember who it was, to prevent it from becoming lost in the shadowy fields of Hades. And yet, there was a dual nature to this gift. For just as the mirror could anchor the soul, it might also ensnare it. If the image seen in the mirror was flawed, or if the soul did not recognize itself, then it might wander, disoriented, unable to move on. In Roman magical texts, scrolls passed quietly among midwives, healers, and mystics. There are references to mirrors used in divination. One could see the future in a mirror or speak with the dead, or summon images of distant places. But these practices always came with warnings. Never perform the ritual alone. Never look into the mirror in total darkness. Never utter your own name while gazing into the reflection. The same themes echo across time and geography. The belief that the mirror is a passage, a threshold, a risk. And so, while philosophers debated the soul's nature and poets wrote of beauty and decay, the mirror remained, quiet, present, holding its unbroken stare. For all the intellect of Athens and all the might of Rome, people still turned mirrors to face the wall after a death, still whispered stories of reflections that blinked when they did not, still held a quiet dread of what might move behind the glass when no one was looking. The tension between self-awareness and self-obsession, between reflection and truth, was never resolved. It was simply lived. And beneath the public face of reason and philosophy, the old fear endured, that to gaze too long at oneself is to invite something other to gaze back, that the soul, already a fragile and restless thing, might be tempted to leap from body to image and vanish behind the gleam. And as the classical world faded, overtaken by fire and flood and time's endless turning, these fears did not vanish. They changed tongues, changed temples, took on new robes of ritual and belief. And they would take root once again, deeper, darker, in the cold stone chapels and candlelit homes of medieval Europe, where death walked close and the soul was always at risk. In the long, slow centuries when the wind crept like a whisper through cathedral naves and the scent of beeswax and old wood hung heavy in the air, the world felt smaller, darker, more tightly bound to mystery. The soul, in these cloistered lands of fog and faith, was not a metaphor for thought or breath, but a real and delicate substance, believed to inhabit the body with a trembling gentleness, like flame cupped in hands, like breath held in silence. It could be taken, tricked, corrupted. It could be stolen. And because it was always in danger, always at the mercy of sin or spirit, people watched it closely, protected it with prayer, hid it with ritual. And so, when the mirror began to spread throughout medieval households, not as a polished bronze disc, but as faint, hand-ground glass framed in iron or wood, it was greeted not with delight, but with quiet, wary suspicion. Mirrors in the medieval world were rare, costly, and deeply unsettling. They reflected more poorly than the polished metal of the ancients, warped, blurred, often cracked with age. But perhaps this made them all the more eerie. To look into a medieval mirror was not to see oneself clearly, but as a ghost might see you, distorted, pale, and floating just behind the glass. The figure that looked back was familiar, yes, but also subtly wrong. Its eyes seemed deeper than they should be, its expression a second slower, its stillness unnatural. And because the church had taught that all things could be vessels of sin or salvation, people began to ask what the mirror truly showed. Was it a reflection of the self or the soul? And worse still, What if it showed something that was neither? To the medieval mind, forged in a world of saints and demons, dreams and damnation, the soul could be tempted from the body not just by sin, but by confusion, by traps, by mirrors. There were whispered tales of souls snared not by devils or witches, but by glass, of men who gazed too long into their own reflection and lost something of themselves, not visibly, not physically, but in a way others could feel. Their words became empty. Their prayers no longer warmed the air. They walked through their days as if submerged, distant, strange. It was said that they had been halved, that their souls still lingered inside the mirror. Priests, ever watchful for heresy and deception, did not speak openly of these things, but some monks, in their marginalia and hidden manuscripts, hinted at dangers in the reflective arts. In letters that passed between abbeys, there were warnings not to use mirrors near the dying, lest their soul be drawn away. In rural chapels, it became common practice to cover or remove all mirrors from a house where death was present. The belief was simple and deeply felt. If a soul saw its reflection in the moment of departure, it might hesitate, it might become trapped, and the church, which spoke of heaven and hell with uncompromising certainty, had no name for what happened to a soul lost in a pane of glass. Women, in particular, were warned. Their association with mirrors became a symbol of both vanity and vulnerability. Paintings began to show Eve not holding an apple, but a mirror. Mary Magdalene, in her repentance, often appeared with a skull in one hand and a mirror in the other, a sign of mortality, yes, but also of danger, a reminder that the mirror does not just show beauty, it shows death, or perhaps worse, it shows what death leaves behind. And so, in the carved oaken halls of noble homes and the smoke-darkened corners of peasant cottages, mirrors were handled carefully. Rarely were they hung on walls like later portraits. Instead, they were wrapped in cloth, stored in chests, brought out only when needed. Some people crossed themselves before using a mirror. Others whispered a prayer. A few, quietly, nervously, would tap the frame, as though to wake the image inside or to remind it who was master. Because by now, the belief had begun to settle that the mirror was not empty, that it was never empty, that when you looked into it, something looked back, and if you caught it unawares, you might see its true face, and if it caught you, it might see your soul. The fear deepened in times of plague, during the Black Death. When death moved through Europe like a tide of ash and sorrow, people grew desperate to understand why some died and others lived. They blamed the air, the stars, the sin of cities. But some whisper that those who kept mirrors near their beds were more likely to die quickly, that the mirror saw the soul slipping before the body knew, and took it. In those years, mirrors were covered en masse. Some were buried with the dead. Others were shattered, broken not from superstition alone, but from grief, the kind of grief that will destroy anything that cannot cry back. Artists began to paint allegories in which mirrors played central, haunting roles. In one common image, a skeleton holds a mirror before a living man. The man, proud and unknowing, smiles at his reflection, unaware that what he sees is not himself, but what he will become. It was not simply memento mori. It was a suggestion that the mirror sees beyond the flesh, that it knows more than we do. And amid all this fear, there remained a quiet truth, that people still looked, still glanced, still returned in unguarded moments to the mirror's uncertain gaze. Because the fear was not only of the mirror stealing the soul, it was also what the soul might look like if truly seen. And so the mirror endured, a quiet presence in a world of loud fears. It sat in silence as candles flickered out. It waited in the dark. It offered no answers, only the reflection. And as the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, with its hunger for clarity, for vision, for light, the mirror would become something more polished, more precise, more widely used. But the soul did not vanish. And the fear, it merely changed shape. Because now, with clearer glass and brighter rooms, people would see their reflections more vividly than ever before, and begin to ask, in whispers once more, whether the thing looking back was truly them, or something waiting behind the glass. As the 15th century ripened into the 16th, and sunlight fell more freely through cathedral windows now lit by human hands and no longer merely divine command, Europe entered a new phase, not forgetting the old fears, but a recasting them in gold and glass and language. The Renaissance, they called it, a rebirth of classical beauty, of inquiry of the self. And it was precisely this, an age in which the individual rose from the crowd, where painters began to sign their own names, and where the soul was still sacred, but now became something to examine, to portray, to question. And as this awakening unfolded across Italy and into France and beyond, the mirror came with it, polished more finely than ever before. In Venice, the mirror makers of Murano perfected techniques of glass-making that turned dull metal and dim reflection into something luminous. Plates of silver-backed glass, clear, gleaming, seductive. These were no longer the warped, rippling surfaces of the medieval age. They were pure, bright, cold, and they showed the self with alarming clarity. To the nobleman, this was luxury. To the merchant, a symbol of status. But to the artist, the philosopher, the thinker, it was something else, something intimate, something unsettling. Because now, for the first time, one could see oneself nearly as others did. No blurring, no softening, no distance. Every blemish was preserved, every glance returned. And in this clarity, the ancient unease returned, not wrapped in superstition, not cloaked in ritual, but reawakened by the sudden, unavoidable truth of the self. Artists like Jan van Eyck and Parmigianino painted mirrors not as props, but as portals. In Van Eyck's Arnolfini portrait, a convex mirror reflects the entire room behind the viewer, catching both the painted figures and the painter himself. It is not just a trick, it is a statement. The mirror sees all. The mirror remembers. In Parmigianino's self-portrait in a convex mirror, the artist's hand is grotesquely enlarged, distorted by the curved surface. A beautiful horror, a reverent nod to the distortion within reflection itself. What is art, after all, if not a mirror of the soul? And if the mirror is warped, what becomes of the soul seen in it? Meanwhile, scientists, men of numbers and angles, studied the mirror with fresh eyes. They calculated light, learned how it bent, how it bounced. They crafted lenses and discovered the telescope, the microscope. They saw deeper and farther than ever before. And yet, in their quiet moments, they too stared into mirrors and did not always like what they saw. For now the fear was not only that the mirror might steal the soul, it was that it might reveal it. And so the object itself grew in power, not because of demons or spells, but because of its precision. A Renaissance mirror was no longer something that might steal a soul by accident. It was something that might expose it, reveal its flaws, or worse, reveal that there was nothing there at all. And this was a darker fear. In the writings of Montaigne and Descartes, the self became a subject of doubt. I think, therefore I am, wrote Descartes, but it was not a statement of confidence. It was a desperate tether in a world where the senses might deceive, where the body could lie, where the reflection could be false. The mirror no longer needed to be magical, to be dangerous. Its danger now lay in what it did not hide. And yet, people could not resist them. The rich filled their chambers with mirrors. Mirrors lined halls and dressing rooms. Courtiers and queens stood before them for hours, examining every angle, searching not just for beauty, but for meaning, for reassurance, for identity. And beneath the silks and pearls and powdered wigs, the old question whispered still. Who is this? Is this me? Or a mask? Or a copy? Or something watching through the glass? Theologians warned against vanity. Mirrors, they said, encouraged sin. They led the soul away from God. To look too long was to forget humility. But artists, ever daring, painted Venus with mirrors, angels with mirrors. Even Christ shone reflected in the eyes of his followers. The mirror was not evil, but it was powerful. It demanded attention. And where attention lingered, the soul might be drawn. Stories began to circulate, quietly, politely, among nobles and servants alike. Stories of women who stared into their mirrors for hours and began to move differently, who blinked out of rhythm with their reflections, who, one day, vanished from a room and were found no more. Stories of children who played near mirrors and began to speak to their own images, whispering as if to a twin only they could see, until they no longer spoke to anyone else at all. Stories of mirrors found veiled in abandoned houses, with no explanation, only the sense that something had once been trapped inside and had since gotten loose. And always, the mirrors remained, shining, waiting, without judgment, without breath. They became, in some homes, almost like shrines, places where people went to speak the thoughts they could not share, where confessions were made not to priests, but to the silent, shining twin. And though no voice ever answered, many swore the mirror changed when they spoke, flickered, shifted, grew darker for a moment, then calm again. In time, the Renaissance gave way to the Baroque and then to the Enlightenment, and still the mirror endured, now more common, more brilliant, framed in gold, displayed with pride. And still people gazed, and still people feared, and still they covered the mirrors when someone died. Because even in an age of science and certainty, one rule remained: the soul is fragile, and the mirror knows this. And as the centuries turned and candles gave way to gaslight, and superstition retreated into nursery rhymes and cautionary tales, a new fear began to form. Not that the mirror would steal the soul by accident, but that someone, somewhere, might learn how to do it on purpose. The flickering light of the Enlightenment may have burned brightly in cities and salons, but across much of early modern Europe, a deeper current still ran, thick with fear, soaked with folklore, and carried forward in whispers between midwives, widows, and the watchful eyes of village elders. It was a time when science lived uncomfortably beside superstition, when books of anatomy were studied by candlelight, even as charms were tied to crib posts and salt was sprinkled at doorways. And in this world of double belief, where both God and ghosts were real, the mirror was no longer merely passive. It had become a vessel, a weapon, an invitation, and sometimes a trap. It was here in hushed parlors and frost-glazed cottages that the belief in the mirror as a soul catcher became sharp and specific. No longer was it just that a soul might be confused by its reflection at the moment of death. No, now the danger was deliberate. The mirror could be used to steal, to imprison, to enchant. And those who knew how to do so, those who studied the hidden arts, spoke to shadows, or scribbled sigils behind closed doors, could use the mirror not only to reflect, but to reach through. Witches, it was said, could speak to spirits in mirrors, could see across distances, could summon demons, and most terribly, could trap a person's soul inside the glass with nothing more than a whisper, a thread of hair, and a mirror turned just so. In court records from Scotland, Germany, and parts of Eastern Europe, testimonies survive, shaky, frightened accounts given by neighbors and children, often under pressure, sometimes under torture. A woman was seen talking to a mirror in the dark. A child was caught placing a black cloth over a mirror at midnight. A mirror was found buried in the garden, its surface smeared with blood. Were these proofs of witchcraft, or were they merely the relics of grief and fear? The line was never clear, but the belief endured. One tale, passed from village to village in the Carpathians, tells of a woman named Mura who lived alone at the forest's edge. They said she kept a mirror that never reflected her image, only the faces of those who wronged her. She would whisper their names to glass, and days later, misfortune would follow. A cow would sicken, a child would fall ill, a man would dream of drowning and not wake up. When she was finally found dead, her mirror was shattered, its shards scattered like dried leaves across the floor. No one dared touch them. They said her soul had been trying to escape. In parts of England, especially the north, the belief in soul mirrors was so strong that travelers carried small round mirrors on their persons, charms backed with prayers or bits of scripture, to reflect back curses or turn away the evil eye. And in more secretive circles, it was whispered that these same objects could be used to capture a piece of someone's essence. All it took was to catch them unaware, laughing, crying, lost in thought, and their soul, or at least a sliver of it, might be pulled through the glass, leaving them less than whole. Mirrors also became tools in love magic, which was perhaps the most quietly practiced and deeply feared magic of time. In these rites, mirrors were placed beside candles, bowls of water, or pieces of fruit. A girl might gaze into the glass at midnight, to glimpse the face of her future husband. But it was not always love that came. Sometimes, they said, something else answered the call. A reflection that moved without her. A face not her own. A voice, soft, coaxing from behind the pane. And it was never to be spoken of afterward. Even the church, which had once shunned all talk of mirrors, began to weave them into their rituals of protection. Some priests would bless a mirror before allowing it in a chapel. Others insisted they be turned to the wall during baptisms or weddings, lest they capture some stray spirit who might seek entry into the soul of a newborn or a bride. And in confessionals across Europe, more than a few quiet voices admitted to fears not their own sin, but of something in their mirror home, something they could not name, something that blinked when they did not. Writers and philosophers, too, began to take notice of these fears. In the journals of the time, in the private letters exchanged between academics, there are subtle references to mirrors as unreliable reporters of the self, as objects whose accuracy made them more, not less, troubling. And slowly, literature began to reflect these anxieties. Fairy tales, the folklore of the common heart, took up the theme. In one, a queen asks her magic mirror who is fairest, and when the answer displeases her, death follows. But the deeper horror is not her jealousy. It is the mirror's sentience, that it knows, that it judges, that it has the power to speak truth, or to lie. In another tale, a young man gazes into a cursed mirror and sees not himself, but what he fears most. He goes mad, and no one can remove the glass from his grasp. In yet another, which creates a mirror that reflects the world in ugliness, turning hearts bitter and eyes blind to love. And when it shatters, its shards lodge in people's eyes and hearts, forever twisting their view of the world. These stories were not warnings against mirrors alone. They were warnings against ourselves, against the soul's vulnerability, against the temptation to look too closely, to know too much, to hold too tightly to an image of the self that might, in truth, not be real at all. And still, the mirrors multiplied. Glass became cheaper, frames more ornate. Whole rooms, palaces, even, were lined with mirrors to show wealth, beauty, light. The Hall of Mirrors at Versailles dazzled the world. Yet even there, it was said that certain mirrors showed more than guests in silk, that when the palace stood empty at night, some reflection stayed behind. And as the modern world approached, with its trains and gas lamps and telegrams, the mirror endured. It adapted, it traveled, and always the soul hovered near. Because even now, even as the world grew louder and brighter, the mirror still offered silence, still offered stillness, still offered a space where the living might see something more or something less than themselves. And in the coming age, that silence would be broken by new voices. The Victorians, with their fascination for mourning, for seances, for the afterlife, would bring the mirror into new rituals, new fears. And the soul, ever fragile, ever drifting, would face new dangers in the depths of polished glass. In the solemn hush of Victorian drawing rooms, where every clock tick seemed a metronome for memory and every photograph a prayer preserved in silver, the mirror did not merely reflect, it mourned. The 19th century, obsessed with the dead yet unwilling to let go of the living, became a fertile ground for a renewed fascination with the soul and all the invisible ways it might linger. And the mirror, ever still, ever watching, found itself caught again in the center of that restless yearning. To live in the Victorian world was to live beside death. Infant mortality was common, disease swift and merciless, and life expectancy still uncertain. And so, in homes draped in black and hearts weighed with grief, the mirror became part of the mourning, not as decoration, but as warning, as ritual, as danger. It was customary, upon the death of a family member, to cover every mirror in the house with black cloth. Sometimes this cloth was thick and edged with fringe. Sometimes it was a simple length of crepe or lace. But the meaning was always the same. The soul must not see itself. The soul, newly loosened from the body, was believed to hover near the places it knew, seeking the comfort of familiar rooms, the presence of loved ones, the shape of its own face. And if it found that face staring back from a mirror, it might become confused, or frightened, or trapped. Because the fear had now evolved beyond superstition, it had become etiquette, refined, codified, published in handbooks, and taught to young girls. To leave a mirror uncovered in a house of mourning was not only seen as careless, but dangerous. It was thought to hinder the soul's passage into the next world, to tether it, to confuse it. Some whispered that it could even drag others down with it, that a second death often followed the first when a mirror had been left uncovered. In this way, grief and fear were married in ritual, and the mirror, mute as always, bore silent witness. Photographs, too, came to play their part. The Victorians, fascinated by the new technology of light captured on paper, began to photograph their dead. Memento mori, portraits were taken of the recently deceased, often posed with open eyes or arranged among their family as though still living. Some of these photos included mirrors, carefully angled. Some were taken with mirrors entirely covered or removed from the room. The decisions were deliberate, thoughtful, heavy with meaning. And yet, even in their scientific curiosity, the Victorians could not escape the lure of the unknown. This was the golden age of spiritualism, the belief that the living could contact the dead, that the soul, though invisible, could be drawn back into speech or sign with the right ritual, the right medium, the right invitation. Seances were held in elegant parlors, hands joined around tables, candles guttering in the breathless dark. And always, the mirrors were covered, because the medium might call to the spirit, but the mirror might hold it, and worse, it might show more than was summoned. In the diaries of mediums and spiritualists, references appear again and again to mirrors that change during sessions, reflections that warp when questions were asked, faces that appeared over shoulders, faces of the dead or of those never seen before. Some even claimed that mirrors themselves could act as portals, needing no table, no cards, no incantations. Only silence, darkness, and an open mind. A famous case in London tells of a family whose child died in her sleep. The next night, the mother, unable to rest, walked through the house. As she passed a hall mirror, one that had not been covered, she saw the faint shape of her daughter within it, standing not in reflection but inside, looking out with wide, unblinking eyes. The mother screamed, the mirror was shattered, and the fragments were buried under yew tree. She never spoke of it again. But from that day forward, every mirror in her house was veiled at night, death or no death. Writers of the time took note of this fear and turned it into art. In poems, mirrors became gateways. In stories, they were traps. Edgar Allan Poe hinted at mirrors in tales of madness and loss. Henry James, in The Turn of the Screw, did not name the mirror, but let its influence linger silent in the reflections of haunted eyes. And as literature shaped culture, the mirror's menace deepened. Children were warned not to stare into them too long. The devil lives behind the glass, some nurses whispered. He waits for your eyes to look away so he can step through. Others told of mirror twins, ghostly doubles who might emerge if one's reflection was gazed upon too often or too fondly. And in asylum records, there are scattered notes about patients who fear mirrors, begged to have them removed, swore their reflections were not their own. All the while, mirrors grew more common. Mass production made them affordable. Gaslight made them shine. But even in their abundance, they were never entirely trusted. A guest might turn a mirror to the wall before sleeping in a new room. A housekeeper might pause when polishing one, uneasy at her own blurred reflection. Children, playing in corridors, might stop mid-laughter if a mirror caught their movement, certain, if only for a moment, that someone else had been laughing too. And always, the fear returned at death, because the soul, in the end, remained fragile. And the mirror, unchanged through centuries, still watched, still waited. And as the Victorian age dimmed into the electric hush of the modern world, the mirror followed quietly. It would soon find new life in cinema, in horror, in the psychological explorations of Freud and Jung. And it would become more than superstition again. It would become symbol. But still, for some, it would remain exactly what it had always been. A thin pane of glass, and a doorway no one was brave enough to leave open for long. As the new century turned and the world began to hum with the rhythm of machines, with the silent glide of streetcars and the soft electric flicker behind lampshades. Something curious happened to the old superstitions. They did not die. They changed their clothing, adopted new voices, moved from whispers in cottages to monologues in theaters, from prayers of mourning women to the notebooks of nervous doctors. And through it all, the mirror remained, more polished, more common, but no less troubling. For even as society declared itself modern, rational, awake, the human soul, so delicately balanced between what is seen and unseen, continued to cast shadows, and the mirror, ever faithful, continued to reflect them. In the silent cinemas of Paris and Berlin, London, and New York, filmmakers quickly discovered that mirrors carried a weight no other prop could match. In early reels of flickering black and white, the mirror appeared again and again, not merely as decoration, but as symbol, as portal, as silent antagonist. In films like The Student of Prague, 1913, the mirror was used to birth a doppelganger, a literal split self, torn from the reflection and made flesh, who then haunted the original until ruin came. The mirror, in these tales, was no longer just a reflective surface. It was an engine of psychological unraveling. Audiences, sitting stiffly in theater seats, gasped as they watched their fears take shape on screen, not as witches or phantoms, but as themselves. Or worse, versions of themselves, changed, twisted, released from the fragile mass of control. Because now, with Freud's writings beginning to take root, the danger was no longer a soul being pulled into the glass by spirits. The danger was a soul already fractured within. The unconscious, Freud wrote, was a vast, unseen part of the mind, where memories slept and desires festered, where fears took shape and identities unraveled. Dreams, slips of the tongue, obsessions, all pointed to something deeper, and the mirror, in this context, became a metaphor for the self confronting itself, not as others saw it, not even as one hoped it might be, but as it truly was. In therapy rooms across Europe, patients spoke of dreams involving mirrors, of reflections that moved on their own, or showed different versions of the self, or stared back with eyes full of contempt or sorrow, or nothing at all. One man dreamed of shaving in front of a mirror, only to realize his reflection did not hold a razor. Another spoke of a mirror that darkened as he approached, and showed only emptiness when he looked in. Jung, Freud's contemporary and eventual rival, took this further. He introduced the idea of the shadow self, the parts of us we hide, repress, or deny. And again, it was the mirror that became the perfect image of this split. The conscious self sees what it wants to see. The shadow, unseen but present, waits just behind the glass. And in this, the ancient fears were given new language. A child frightened by their own reflection was no longer merely superstitious. They were said to be confronting the early tension between ego and ID. A woman who covered mirrors after her husband's death was no longer just following folklore. She was performing a deeply symbolic act of protecting her inner world from fragmentation. The act of gazing into a mirror too long became a subject of psychiatric concern. Mirror gazing disorder entered clinical discussions related to obsessive self-scrutiny and dissociation. Patients who could not stop looking at themselves, and those who refused to look at all, were studied with equal care. But it was not only in clinics and films that the mirror continued to disturb. It remained in homes, in bedrooms, now mass-produced and cheaply framed, now bright with electric light. And while fewer people may have believed that their soul could be literally pulled into glass, more and more began to suspect that the mirror told them truths they did not want to hear. Teenagers, in particular, were drawn to it. In hushed dormitories and quiet basements, they played games, rituals born from playground folklore, now updated for modern fears. Bloody Mary, they whispered, daring each other to speak her name 3 times before a mirror in the dark. Some laughed. Others swore they saw something. Just a flicker, just a face, just a moment when a reflection wasn't quite right. And even those who scoffed at such tales would sometimes find themselves alone, brushing their teeth in the blue light of early morning and hesitate, just for a second, just long enough to wonder whether the eyes staring back were perfectly still. In literature, the mirror continued its steady haunting. Jean Cocteau's Orpheus reimagined the myth of Orpheus with mirrors as portals to the underworld, shimmering and fluid. Sylvia Plath, in her poem Mirror, gave the object its own voice, a cold, silver, unflinching observer of time and decay. I am not cruel, only truthful, the mirror says. The eye of a little god, four-cornered. The poem ends with a woman, day after day, searching her reflection for the girl she once was, and finding instead an old woman rising toward her like a terrible truth from beneath the surface. By mid-century, the mirror had become not merely a folkloric object of fear, but a psychological one, a surface onto which the modern self projected everything it could not admit. People spoke now of identity crises, of fragmented personalities, of false selves. But in simpler words, they meant the same thing that villagers and mourners had meant for centuries, that sometimes a reflection is not trustworthy, that sometimes it knows something we do not, that sometimes when we look long enough and hard enough, the thing we see is not us, or worse is, and the mirror, unchanged, held its silence. Even now, in a world of glowing screens and constant distraction, the mirror waits. The glass is sharper, clearer, backed with stronger silver. It no longer warps or ripples, but the fear has not faded. It has simply learned new names. Soon, the mirror would enter the digital world. Its reflection captured not just in glass, but in pixels, in photographs, in videos. The self, once preserved in fading portraits and blurred frames, will become permanent, editable, shareable. And the soul, ever watchful, ever vulnerable, would face new kinds of distortion. For the old fear never truly dies. It only updates. In the softdom of the 21st century, amid the constant flicker of screens and the silent scroll of endless faces, the mirror did not disappear. It transformed. It stepped through the glass, out of frame, and into the hand. It became the front-facing camera, the filtered selfie, the soft glow of the locked screen's reflection in a darkened bedroom. The digital mirror no longer requires silver or shadow. It exists in every device, in every shared image, in every moment when someone turns a camera not outward, but inward. And now it is always on. For the first time in history, people do not need to seek out their reflection. It finds them. Every time they unlock their phone, every time they open a chat, every time they check the angle of their face on a video call, the reflection is there, persistent, persistent, persistent. It is no longer silent and still. It is dynamic, immediate, and endlessly editable. And yet, for all its convenience, for all its technology, the modern mirror may be the most deceptive of all, because in this mirror, the soul is not merely reflected, it is curated. The age of the selfie brought with it something strange and subtle, the ability not just to see oneself, but to create oneself, to shape the face in the mirror not with makeup or expression, but with pixels and presets. Filters smooth the skin, widen the eyes, narrow the chin, brighten the teeth. 1,000 small edits, soft and easy, invisible to the untrained eye. And over time, they become the standard. The face in the mirror is no longer real, but neither is it entirely false. It is a dream version, a projected soul. And what happens then when the real face returns? Many report a quiet sense of shock when their unfiltered reflection appears. Flat lighting, tired eyes, wrinkles untouched. Some feel grief, others feel anger, and some, quietly and without speaking of it, begin to feel unrecognizable. The mirror, once feared for its ability to show too much, is now feared for showing too little the self one wishes to be. And yet, the filtered face is not truly false. It is, in its own way, a desire given form, a soul, smooth and sharpened into what the heart believes might be loved. But this too comes with a cost. Psychologists now write of the Snapchat dysmorphia, a new kind of body image disorder, where patients do not ask to look like celebrities, but to look like their filtered selves. The lines between self and ideal have blurred. The digital mirror does not only reflect, it seduces, and then it demands. Children grow up seeing their reflections constantly, not in mirrors, but in videos, in pictures, in carefully chosen avatars. They learn to monitor their expressions, to pose, to smile just right. But sometimes, when left alone, they look into the still mirror on the wall and feel something uncanny, as if they do not quite recognize the person there, as if the soul, somewhere along the scroll, has shifted. And social media, This vast, invisible crowd of mirrors only deepens the sensation. Every photo posted is a reflection, curated for an invisible audience. Every like is a nod of approval from the mirror's other side. And every pause, every silence, every scroll without comment feels like the glass growing colder. And so, people post again, look again, edit again, waiting for the mirror to speak, to validate, to reassure. But it never truly does. It reflects, it refracts, it distorts, it delays. And while the danger is no longer a soul being stolen into glass, it is perhaps something lonelier, a soul scattered into fragments, bits of identity spread across platforms, across versions, across years. The person on the screen smiling in vacation photos is not the person crying in the mirror at night. The voice in a caption is not the same as the silence in the room. And the reflection, constant and shifting, is never whole. Even in the language of the digital world, we find the echo of older fears. We speak of ghosting, of lurking, of shadow banning. We fear the algorithm watching from behind the screen, predicting our moves. And though we no longer use words like soul trap or mirror curse, we still carry the unease that to look too long at oneself in the digital mirror is to become untethered, to forget who we were before the reflection began. And now, even artificial intelligence begins to mirror us, responding, replicating, learning our speech, our faces, our thoughts. In this new glass, the soul is not merely reflected. It is studied, simulated, reproduced. And while we tell ourselves it is not real, not alive, not aware, we still feel the shiver, that perhaps the thing behind the screen knows us too well, that perhaps it is not a reflection, perhaps it is a shadow. And all the while, the physical mirror endures, still hung on walls, still found in hotel rooms, elevators, fitting rooms, still watched in quiet moments when the phone is set down, still capable of returning a gaze that feels just a little too deep. Because for all our advancements, for all our editing tools and confidence, the mirror has not changed. Its surface is smoother. Its context is different. But it still does what it always did. It shows the self, not just the face, not just the pose, but the self. And for many, that is still too much. The soul, ever elusive, still flickers behind the eyes, still waits to be recognized. And in the mirror, digital or glass, it sometimes finds itself, and sometimes it does not. Far across the oceans, beyond the dust of cathedrals and the ache of gaslit cities, the mirror found different meanings. It gleamed in temples instead of boudoirs. It was hidden in the earth rather than hung on walls. In some places, it was a symbol of the divine. In others, a vessel of spirits. And in many, it was so potent that it was never meant to be looked upon directly at all. These were not cultures of glass and silver alone, but of polished stone, water, obsidian, and bronze, surfaces that revealed not the skin, but the unseen. In Japan, the mirror holds a place of extraordinary reverence and fear. Deep within the ancient stories of Shinto, the native spiritual tradition of Japan, there is a mirror not made for vanity, but for gods. The Yada no Kagami, the 8-span mirror, is one of the 3 sacred treasures of Japan, a holy artifact said to have been used to lure the sun goddess Amaterasu from her cave, where she had hidden in grief and anger, casting the world into darkness. The gods placed a mirror outside the cave and danced, and Amaterasu, curious, stepped out to see what had drawn such celebration. When she saw her own radiant reflection, she paused. And in that pause, the other gods sealed the cave behind her, bringing light back to the world. From that moment forward, the mirror became sacred, not for the way it captured beauty, but for its power to reveal divinity. And even now, in Shinto shrines, mirrors are often kept behind doors or veils, unseen by the public, reflecting only the gods. To look directly into such a mirror is considered not just disrespectful, but spiritually dangerous. It is not your face that you might see. It is a truth of your soul, and that truth, unprepared, might break you. In traditional Japanese folklore, too, mirrors can harbor spirits. The concept of Tsukumagami speaks of objects, including mirrors, that after 100 years of existence, gain sentience and spirit. A mirror kept too long, especially one that has seen much grief or anger, might awaken, and if it does, it may begin to act. Reflections might change. Faces might linger. People might begin to feel watched even when alone. Some stories tell of haunted mirrors that show the future or future, and others that draw people into their depths, not physically, but spiritually, leaving them quiet, changed, different. In rural villages, it was once common to cover mirrors during thunder, or after childbirth, or in times of illness, not out of superstition alone, but because the mirror was understood to be a threshold, and thresholds are always vulnerable. Thousands of miles away, across oceans and deserts, the belief in mirrors as gateways is echoed again. Among certain African traditions, the mirror is not an idle object, but a medium. In Yoruba spiritual practices, mirrors are sometimes used by diviners to speak to the spirits of ancestors or to see into the hidden paths of fate. Here, the mirror is often combined with water, still, black, and silent. It becomes a tool not for looking at the self, but through the self. The image that appears is not always visible to the untrained. Sometimes it is a feeling, sometimes a whisper, and always it is treated with care. In stories passed down through generations, there are mirrors that contain voices, mirrors that respond to questions, mirrors that are buried with the dead, either to seal their spirit in peace or to guard against their return. Some families refuse to keep mirrors in the room of the dying. Others place them deliberately so that the soul might pass through more easily. In both cases, the message is the same. The mirror is not neutral. Among some Central African communities, particularly in Congo and parts of Angola, mirrors were embedded in ritual objects like the Nkisi, wooden statues with mirrors placed on the belly or head. These were not for self-reflection, but for spiritual negotiation. They reflected not the body, but the invisible, the world of spirits, the moral standing of a person, the state of community. To look into such a mirror was not about grooming. It was about confrontation, with justice, with memory, with the unseen weight of one's actions. In the highlands of Peru, in Andean cultures whose roots stretch back to the Inca, the piedra espejo, or mirror stones, were used in ceremonies, polished obsidian or dark water, reflecting the stars above. The shaman would peer into them not to see themselves, but to align the spirit with the cosmos, to understand sickness or sorrow, or to journey inward toward understanding. There are tales of those who, after gazing too long, fell silent for days, neither ill nor injured, but caught in a space between. Among the Navajo of the American Southwest, mirrors were traditionally avoided as tools of vanity. A person who spent too long staring at their reflection was thought to be inviting imbalance, losing connection with the land, with kin, with the sacred order of life. Some tales spoke of reflections that could begin to speak or act independently, and so, while not forbidden, the mirror was approached with humility. All these beliefs, from Japan to Africa to the Americas, differ in detail but echo in tone. The mirror is a tool, a risk, a doorway, not something to be feared without thought, but never something to be dismissed entirely. It watches, it remembers, it can open, and the soul, ever gentle, ever watchful, must tread carefully near its glass. And now, as these ancient beliefs whisper beneath the surface of modern life, the mirror still waits in corners, in shrines, in hidden rooms, sometimes dusty, sometimes wrapped, sometimes polished so brightly that it almost seems to pulse with something living. For though we may speak in new languages, with new devices and theories and terms, the oldest fear remains, that to see oneself is not always safe, that the mirror may see more than the eyes, that something may be watching back, and that the soul, however quiet, still leaves a trace on the glass. There is a peculiar kind of chill that creeps in not from the cold, but from the suggestion that something has gone terribly, quietly wrong in a place we thought was safe. The bedroom, the bathroom, the hallway, the places where mirrors live, waiting, shining, watching. In these common rooms of modern life, stories are born, stories in which the mirror does not merely reflect, but reacts, in which it remembers things we do not, and in which, if we are not careful, it might show us something we were never meant to see. Across countless cultures, the haunted mirror remains a fixture of the modern ghost story. It is the object that glints behind a sleeping child, the thing that catches a movement that no one else saw, the place where reflection lingers for a moment too long. And always, the fear is the same, that the mirror is not merely glass. It is a thin, fragile wall between our world and something deeper, darker, and far more patient. Perhaps the most widely known mirror legend in the modern world is that of Bloody Mary. The name itself shifts with region and generation. Maryworth, Mary Wales, Hail Mary, but the ritual remains strikingly consistent. A darkened room, a mirror, a name repeated 3 times, or sometimes 13. A candle, perhaps, a dare, a silence, and then a face. Children across the globe whisper her story at sleepovers. They speak her name into the bathroom mirror with laughter in their throats and hesitation in their hands. Some say she appears with bleeding eyes, others with a scream. Some say she drags the summoner into the mirror. Others claim she merely watches. But the rules are always clear. Once called, she cannot be undone. What is striking about this legend is not only its endurance, but its ritualistic form. It mirrors, no pun intended, older forms of summoning, of prayer, of invocation. But here, the mirror is no longer sacred. It is malevolent, and what was once a tool for divine reflection is now a stage for terror. The child becomes a summoner, the mirror the gate, and whatever lies behind it, waiting always comes when called. In Hong Kong, there's a tale told of a woman who rented an old apartment and found a large mirror in the bedroom that she could not remove. Each night, she dreamed of drowning, of a figure behind the glass, pulling her down, and each morning, she would wake with bruises on her arms. When she finally hired workers to remove the mirror, they found a shallow cavity behind it, and inside, the skeletal remains of a previous tenant long forgotten. Whether the mirror had shown the truth or cause it was never certain. In Brazil, there's a legend of Loira do Banheiro, the blonde in the bathroom. She is said to haunt school bathrooms, appearing in mirrors if her name is called with the proper ritual. Sometimes candy is involved. Sometimes a tap on the mirror. The details shift. But always, there is a reflection that does not behave. A face that should not be there. In Russia, some ghost stories speak of mirror nights, where the person falls asleep in front of a mirror during certain holy days or lunar phases. Their reflection may act on its own. When they wake, they may find things moved, items missing, pets frightened, and sometimes, in rare cases, a faint impression of their own face pressed outward from the other side. In the American South, legends speak of plantation homes with mirrors that never seem to stay clean, glass that fogs over without reason, no matter how it is polished. Some say these mirrors are spirit-caught, reflections of long-dead inhabitants who were not properly mourned, or worse, who were wronged in life and now remain pacing just behind the glass, waiting for someone to see them, to speak their name. And in modern urban legends posted online forums, the mirror has taken on a digital afterlife. Stories are shared of cursed mirrors bought online, delivered wrapped in old cloth, sometimes with notes warning not to uncover them until night. Other tales tell of antique mirrors from estate sales that begin to show strange reflections, people standing behind the viewer who vanish when they turn. Phones, used to photograph these mirrors, sometimes capture faces not seen with the naked eye. Others claim that mirrors placed opposite one another, creating an infinite tunnel reflection, can become unstable after dark, causing dreams, migraines, or strange whispers in the middle of the night. Common to all of these legends, whether ancient or freshly invented, is the idea that the mirror remembers, that it absorbs something of what it sees, that it watches more than we know. Some stories go further still. There are accounts, fictional or otherwise, of people who believe that a part of them has become trapped in a mirror, not their body, not even their mind, but some sliver of their essence, something that was drawn out slowly over time by too much staring, too much self-examination. They begin to feel detached. They stop recognizing their own voice. Their dreams grow strange. And always, when they pass a mirror, they pause, because they know somehow they're missing something, and it might still be in there. Even therapists, psychologists, and scientists have documented instances of patients developing intense discomfort or even phobias around mirrors. A rare condition known as isopterophobia refers to a fear of mirrors or of seeing one's reflection. In extreme cases, patients will cover or remove all reflective surfaces, convinced that something within a mirror is watching, waiting, perhaps even whispering in a language they cannot understand. And yet, despite all this, we continue to look. We keep mirrors in our homes. We check our reflections each morning. We pose for selfies. We edit our images. We stare into our eyes, searching for something, perhaps reassurance, perhaps recognition, or perhaps the faint, flickering feeling that once, long ago, the mirror was more than a surface. It was a presence. And in these stories, these urban myths and fireside tales, that presence lives on, waiting, watching, just beyond the glass. There is something inherently unsettling about watching someone look at themselves in a mirror on film. Perhaps it's the intimacy, an actor alone, stripped of performance, facing their own reflection. Or perhaps it's what the audience knows to expect, that the reflection may not behave, that the face might change, that something might be waiting behind them, just out of frame, still and silent and watching. From the earliest days of horror cinema to the present, mirrors have been used not merely as props, but as tools of narrative disquiet. Devices that suggest a fracture, a duality, a thinness in the barrier between reality and something other. In these stories, the mirror reflects not truth, but something worse. The possibility that the self can be wrong, that memory can betray, that the mind can fracture, and that what we see might be what destroys us. Take, for instance, the 1997 film Event Horizon. Though a science fiction horror set in space, its terrors are deeply psychological. In one of the most unsettling scenes, a character sees visions of their past within a mirror-like window, an image so vivid it seems real. The mirror does not show reality, but memory, desire, regret. It is not a tool, it is a trigger, a doorway into madness. And this theme recurs again and again across the genre. Mirrors as objects that reveal too much of the mind, too much of the soul. In Candyman 1992 and its 2021 reimagining, the mirror becomes a ritual space, the summoning ground. Say the name. Say it again. Say it 5 times. And watch. The mirror becomes a medium between belief and consequence, between legend and the body. It is not the monster that is terrifying, but the act of speaking into the glass, of using the mirror not to see oneself, but to reach something that lives just behind the surface. In Oculus 2013, the mirror itself is a monster, an antique object passed down through time that corrupts perception, alters memory, and causes hallucinations. Its victims cannot tell what is real. Time shifts, voices lie, and the mirror, cold and unmoving, remains untouched. It does not lurch forward like a monster. It simply reflects, and that reflection unravels everything. The horror here is subtle, insidious. It is the fear that your own mind might betray you under the influence of something that should not have power, and yet does. This theme of perception, of mirrors as agents of psychological distortion, is especially prominent in films where the protagonist is already unstable. In Black Swan 2010, Nina's descent into madness is punctuated by mirrors that do not always return her gaze faithfully. Her reflection lags, smirks, turns away. She looks and sees not just herself, but the self she is becoming or the self she fears. The mirrors do not move, but her identity does, slipping across the glass like oil, never quite solid, never quite safe. And in The Shining 1980, Kubrick uses mirrors not only as visual motifs, but as signals of doubling and dissociation. Jack stares into mirrors just before his descent accelerates. Rooms contain mirrored surfaces that reflect characters from angles they do not notice. In one pivotal scene, Jack converses with ghosts in a bathroom. Both men framed perfectly by a mirror that neither seems to acknowledge. The viewer sees the ghost. Jack sees the ghost. But the reflection offers no clues, only confirmation that what is seen may not be what is real. Even in subtle films, quiet, creeping stories with no jump scares, the mirror lingers. In The Others 2001, the mirror is a background presence, always present in the dim, shadowy house. Its threat is never overt, but its presence reminds the viewer again and again that there are unseen angles, hidden truths, and that a reflection, especially one not looked at directly, might contain something waiting to be revealed. In these films, the mirror becomes shorthand for themes that go beyond horror. It symbolizes identity, memory, the fragmentation of the self. It stands at the edge of psychosis and clarity. And it does so not by moving or screaming or chasing, but by waiting, watching, reflecting something just slightly off. That is the key, slightly off. Because the horror of the mirror is rarely immediate. It's not the monster in the hallway or the blood on the floor. It's the reflection that tilts its head when you do not. The face that stays smiling just a moment too long. The movement in the background that no one else noticed. These are quiet terrors. Internal, psychological. They creep in slowly, settle in the chest, whisper in the dark. And modern audiences, far from dismissing these fears, seem drawn to them. The rise of found footage in paranormal films in the 2000s and 2010s, like Paranormal Activity, The Ring, and Sinister, brought mirrors back in force. Surveillance cameras, night vision feeds, and reflected screens became modern mirrors. Faces caught at the edge of perception. Shadows that only appear in playback. A sense that we are always being watched, not just by the world, but by our own reflections, which may be watching us back with a different agenda. Social media has only added to this fear. With apps that allow face filters, reversal, beauty enhancements, and live reflections, we have created a world in which mirrors lie constantly. We adjust our appearance in real time. We create versions of ourselves. And horror films now tap into this, asking the question, what happens when the version we created becomes independent, when the reflection lives without us? In Us, 2019, Jordan Peele explores this idea literally. The shadow selves that live underground, reflections made real. And in doing so, he forces the viewer to consider, what if our worst fears about ourselves are not hallucinations? What if they are just waiting beneath the surface to emerge? So the mirror persists. No longer just a frame of silver and glass, it has become a metaphorical device used to explore madness, guilt, trauma, duality, and regret. And always, the fear remains that the reflection knows something we do not, that it sees the truth beneath the mask, that it remembers every lie we've told ourselves. Because in the end, the most terrifying thing the mirror can reflect is not a ghost or a monster, but the parts of ourselves we try to forget. In the hush of late-night forums, in the private notes of therapy sessions, in the whispered voice messages left on paranormal podcasts, people continue to speak of mirrors with unease, though most would never call themselves superstitious, and many claim no belief in ghosts or the supernatural. Something about the mirror seems to push beyond the realm of logic. Time and again, when people recount the strangest things that have happened to them, the ones they hesitate to admit even to themselves, it is the mirror that returns to the center of the story. Quiet, unmoving, but changed. One woman, in her late 30s, recounted a story on a call-in show about a mirror she inherited from her grandmother. It was small, oval, set in a silver frame that had tarnished over time, and it had hung in her grandmother's hallway for as long as she could remember. After the old woman's death, she brought it home, more out of sentiment than decoration, and placed it in her guest room. But over the weeks that followed, she began to dream, long, quiet dreams of hallways that stretched forever, of distant voices calling her name, of her grandmother sitting in a chair, staring at her, but not speaking. Each morning, she woke with a heaviness in her chest. One morning, while changing the sheets in the guest room, she glanced into the mirror and saw, for the briefest instant, not her own reflection, but her grandmother's face, pale and blank-eyed, just behind her own. She did not scream. She did not even move. But she never went into the room again. A teenager on an online forum described an experience during quarantine. Isolated, scrolling endlessly through her phone, she began to feel detached from herself. She said that her reflection began to feel less like a reflection and more like a stranger. She would make expressions in the mirror, silly or dramatic, and find that the reflection didn't match. Sometimes it seemed to lag. Other times, it seemed to smile more slowly or not at all. At first, she blamed sleep deprivation. But one night, just before bed, she leaned close to the mirror and whispered, "You're not me." And the reflection, still perfectly her, raised its eyebrows. She hadn't. She was sure of it. She turned away, heart racing. When she looked back, the reflection was normal. But she covered the mirror that night. And every night after, a man in his 60s posted anonymously to a dream study site, detailing a recurring nightmare he had after purchasing a large antique mirror from a second-hand shop. The mirror was beautiful, ornate, heavy, and lined with carved roses. But ever since it had been hung in his dining room, he claimed his dreams had turned. He dreamed of narrow, endless rooms, each with a mirror at the end, and behind each mirror, someone who looked like him, but older, more decayed, with empty eyes. The dream would always end with him standing before the final mirror, unable to move, as the other version of himself reached out, not from the other side, but toward the glass itself, as if trying to cross over. He eventually removed the mirror from the wall and placed it in his garage, face down. The dream stopped. He never sold it, never touched it again. But he said he still sometimes hears a faint sound in the night, the soft scrape of something shifting against the wall. Another account came from a nurse who worked long overnight shifts. Her apartment had a narrow hallway with a mirror at one end. After particularly exhausting shifts, she would arrive home just before dawn, and more than once, she claimed, she would see movement in the mirror before she reached it. Not behind her, but within it, something darting past, something low and fast. Once, she stood completely still at the far end of the hallway and stared. The hallway behind her was empty, but in the mirror, she swore, a figure stood in the reflection, tall, thin, motionless. She blinked, and it was gone. She removed the mirror the next day. She didn't tell anyone, but she moved out of that apartment 3 months later and chose a new place with no mirrors in any hallways at all. Among all these accounts, there's a quiet thread of hesitation. Not all of the people who shared these stories believe they experienced something supernatural. Some chalked it up to stress, lack of sleep, the mind's tendency to seek patterns. But each admitted, carefully, quietly, that something felt different, that their reflection had taken on a weight they hadn't felt before, that something inside them, or perhaps around them, had shifted. Psychologists who study such phenomena often refer to the mirror self-misidentification delusion, a rare condition in which a person believes the image in the mirror is not their own. But many who share these stories are not delusional, not disturbed. They are stable. They are ordinary. And still, the mirror unnerved them. It is perhaps not the events themselves, but the silence that follows them that is most disturbing. The quiet feeling that something watched, that something waited, that the mirror, so passive, so ordinary, was aware. There's a famous quote, often misattributed, that says, "Monsters are real and ghosts are real too. They live inside us and sometimes they win." Perhaps what the mirror shows us, when it chooses, is not the supernatural, but the internal. Not a ghost, but a memory. Not a stranger, but the self, cracked slightly, blurred by time, distorted by fear. And still, the stories continue. New ones are posted every day. On Reddit, on YouTube, on anonymous confession sites. Stories of mirrors bought and sold, inherited and feared, covered with cloth or stored in basements. Stories from those who never believed in ghosts, until the mirror blinked first. Because the mirror, like grief, like memory, like the past, never truly lets go. It holds the image. It holds the silence. It holds the gaze of the soul, even when the eyes are closed. There are places the waking world cannot touch. Spaces shaped not by brick or wood or steel, but by memory, desire, and fear. These are the provinces of subconscious, a vast, unlit country where the soul walks barefoot and alone, guided only by instinct and a quiet hum of longing. And it is here, in this shifting space where time folds and meaning shimmers, that the mirror appears again. Not as glass, not always as object, but as symbol, a presence, a thing that waits at the center of the labyrinth. The appearance of a mirror in dreams has long been understood as significant. In modern psychoanalysis, Particularly in the work of Jung and his followers, the mirror is seen as a portal into the self. Not the persona, not the mask worn for the world, but the deeper self, buried and often hidden. When a person dreams of a mirror, they are believed to be approaching a moment of internal reckoning, a confrontation with something they have denied, forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood. In dreams, mirrors do not behave like their waking counterparts. They ripple, they delay, they distort. Often, dreamers report seeing not themselves, but another version, a child, an older self, a stranger with familiar eyes. Sometimes the face is grotesquely altered. Other times, it simply won't appear at all. A dreamer stares into a mirror and finds only fog or darkness, or the room behind them. Empty, silent, endless. These visions, say therapists who work with dream symbolism, speak of identity fracture, of unresolved grief, of the quiet terror that the person we believe we are might not be real at all. In ancient myth, too, the mirror or the reflective surface returns again and again, not merely as a device but as a trial. In the Greek tale of Narcissus, it is not a glass mirror that causes a youth's downfall, but the surface is still water, a natural mirror, soft and deadly. He falls in love with his own reflection, unable to pull away, unaware at first that it is himself he sees. And so he wastes away. Some versions say he drowns. Others say he fades. But always, the lesson is the same. To love the image too much is to forget the self beneath. Yet even this story is layered. It is not only vanity that consumes Narcissus. It is longing. It is separation. It is the pain of seeing something beautiful and unreachable, something he desires but cannot claim, because it is him. This myth has endured not because of its warning against pride, but because of its quiet despair, that we may see ourselves clearly, and still not be able to hold what we are. In Egyptian lore, the mirror was tied to the goddess Hathor, who embodied joy, music, and motherhood, but also the mirror. Priests would carry mirrors into rituals, not as tools of appearance, but as instruments of divine alignment. The mirror was believed to reveal the hidden self, or even offer glimpses into the afterlife. When one gazed into the polished bronze surface, one might see not just a face, but who they had been, or who they would become. Death, in these rituals, was not a vanishing but a transition, and the mirror was the threshold. Across Asia, mirrors held similar dualities. In Buddhist texts, the mind is often compared to a mirror, clear, reflective, capable of showing all things as they are, but easily clouded by emotion, desire, and delusion. Meditation is the act of polishing that inner mirror, to reflect without distortion, to see without ego. And in dreams, when mirrors appear broken or stained, they are said to reflect spiritual imbalance. Even in the modern West, where dreams are often dismissed as neurological noise, the mirror persists in the symbolic landscape. In Jungian psychology, the mirror is closely tied to the concept of the shadow, the unconscious self, made of all that we hide from ourselves. To dream of the mirror is to approach the shadow, to risk seeing what we have exiled. In dream journals shared by ordinary people across decades, patterns emerge. One woman dreams of brushing her hair in a mirror and watching strands turn to ash. A man dreams of shaving and watching blood flow from the reflection's neck, though he feels no pain. A teenager dreams of facing a mirror and finding no reflection at all. Only a deep hallway, lined with doors, each one whispering his name. These are not dreams of vanity. They are dreams of loss, of identity, of the creeping fear that something within has shifted beyond recognition. Some who have studied these patterns believe that the mirror in dreams functions like a test. It asks the dreamer, do you know who you are? Are you whole? Are you awake within yourself? And when the answer is no, or when the answer is avoided, the mirror changes. It withholds, or it shows too much. There are also tales of healing. A man once wrote a recurring dream where he looked into a mirror and saw a version of himself he did not recognize. Older, stronger, with lines of sorrow and peace. He said this figure smiled at him, gently, and each time the dream returned, he felt calmer, less afraid. He came to believe that this was not a warning, but a guide, a message from the self he had not yet become. In myth, too, mirrors are not always malevolent. The Japanese tale of Amaterasu, as we have seen, centers on a goddess lured from hiding by her own radiant reflection, reminded of her beauty, her power, her place in the sky. In this story, the mirror is not a trap, but a rescue, a way back to the world. And so, we see both faces of the mirror in the subconscious, the threat and the invitation, the fear of disintegration, and the hope of reunion. To gaze into a mirror in dreams is to come close to something primal, to the moment of self-recognition, to the birth of awareness. It is the eye meeting itself and not looking away. Some who work with dreams believe the mirror appears when the mind is ready, that we do not see ourselves in the dream mirror until we are strong enough to face what waits there. Others say it is random, a flicker of memory, an echo, but even they pause sometimes when describing certain dreams. Dreams in which the reflection moves on its own. Dreams in which the mirror speaks. Dreams in which the dreamer wakes. And for a moment, in the quiet of the early morning light, they are afraid to look at the real mirror by the bed. Because deep down, even in this age of science and screens and schedules, the soul remembers. It remembers that the mirror is more than glass. It is the place where you meet yourself. And sometimes, that is the scariest thing of all. There are few experiences in life as universally human, and yet as deeply personal as the loss of someone we love. In those early days of mourning, when the world feels distant and muffled, when everything that once seemed important fades into shadows, our relationship to space and time shifts. We move more slowly. We speak less. We find ourselves staring into corners, into windows, into our hands, and often, most unsettling of all, into mirrors. It is in those moments, when the house has grown silent, when the bed is half empty, when the familiar voice is absent from the kitchen, that the mirror becomes something else entirely. Not a place for grooming, not a place for vanity, but a reflection of absence. And so, throughout history, people have turned to rituals, quiet, reverent gestures that recognize the strange power of the reflective surface in the face of death. In Jewish mourning tradition, one of the first acts performed in a house of mourning is the covering of mirrors. This practice, observed during Shiva, the 7-day mourning period following the burial, is layered with meaning. On one level, it is a gesture of modesty. Mourning is not a time for vanity, for appearances, for distraction. The focus is inward, spiritual. But beneath that, there is something more ancient. Some rabbis say that mirrors are covered because they reflect life, and to reflect life in the presence of death is a kind of spiritual dissonance. Others believe that mirrors might confuse the soul of the departed, which lingers for a time, hovering between worlds. A mirror, they say, might trap the soul, or mislead it. Whatever the reason, the act itself carries a weight that is deeply felt. A home with covered mirrors feels different, quieter, more contemplative, more sacred. In Victorian England, during the height of mourning culture in the 19th century, mirrors were also covered, often with thick black cloth or lace, immediately upon a death in a house. The belief was similar, that mirrors might trap the soul of the departed, or worse, reflect their spirit wandering. Superstition aside, the gesture had a symbolic effect. It removed the face from the equation. The mourner was no longer required to see their own grief, etched in the eyes, heavy in the shoulders, worn across the mouth. The house became a space of stillness, a place where time had momentarily stopped. There are stories from this period, quiet, rarely spoken, of those who claimed to have seen the dead in the glass. A faint outline, a shape passing behind them, a face that flickered once, then vanished. Whether hallucination, longing, or something else entirely, these experiences reinforce the belief that mirrors are not neutral observers, that they carry emotion, that they echo presence. In parts of rural Ireland, it was once said that a mirror left uncovered after a death might show the next to die. And so, out of both respect and fear, mirrors were carefully veiled. In these communities, where generations shared homes and loss was a frequent visitor, the veil was as much for the living as for the dead. To look into a mirror after death was not merely unsettling, it was dangerous. The boundary between life and death had been thinned, and the mirror, always sensitive to such shifts, was best left silent. Even outside of formal tradition, Many people instinctively alter their relationship to mirrors during grief. Some stop looking altogether. Others begin to see themselves differently, not older or younger, but somehow unfamiliar. There is often a feeling, they say, that something is missing from the reflection. Not a wrinkle, not a shadow, but something deeper, a sense of unity, a tether. When someone we love dies, a part of our identity dissolves, and the mirror, ever truthful, does not hide that loss. It simply reflects it. In dreams, too, the mirror and mourning intertwine. Therapists who work with grief often hear dreams in which the mourner sees the deceased in a mirror, not behind them, not beside them, but instead of them. They look and their own face is missing, or transformed, or replaced. These dreams are not always frightening. Some are peaceful, even tender, but they carry a message that grief changes itself, that in losing someone, we become someone else. And the mirror, silent and patient, shows us this long before we are ready to accept it. In some indigenous North American beliefs, particularly among the Cree and Ojibwe, it was taught that the soul lingers for several days after death, traveling slowly to the other world. During this time, people were advised to be mindful of reflective surfaces, water, glass, mirrors. These were seen as thresholds, places where spirits might pause or become confused. And so, during mourning, the community altered the environment, covered mirrors, turned pictures inward, kept fires low. It was a gesture of care, of protection, not only for the living, but for the soul on its journey. Even in modern times, echoes of this caution persist. A widow, writing anonymously in a grief support forum, shared that after her husband's death, she avoided the mirror in their shared bathroom for nearly a year. Not because of fear, but because every time she looked, she expected to see something beside her, a memory, a presence, a whisper, and when she didn't, the emptiness hurt more than she could bear. So she stopped looking, and only much later, when healing had begun, did she uncover the mirror again. Others speak of feeling watched, not by a presence, but by the absence itself, that the mirror remembers who once stood beside them, that it reflects not only form, but history. Perhaps that is the true reason mirrors have long been linked to mourning, because they do not forget. They reflect the space where someone once stood. They hold the light that once lit a face now gone. They remember the curve of a shoulder, the smile at the corner of the mouth, the familiar outline of someone no longer there. And in doing so, they reflect not just the living, but the whole left behind. To cover a mirror is not an act of superstition alone. It is an act of kindness. It is a pause, a veil, a moment of grace in a world too quick to resume. And when the time comes and the cloth is removed and the mourner once again faces a glass, what they see may not yet be healing, but it will be honest. The mirror will show them who they are now, changed, weathered, still here. And in that silent reflection there may come not understanding but acceptance, and eventually the gentlest beginning of peace. There is a moment, usually around the age of 18 months, when a child looks into a mirror and does something profoundly simple and yet utterly transformative. They touch their nose, they smile, they blink, they begin to connect the movement of the image in the mirror with their own body, their own self. Before this point, the reflection is merely another baby, an amusing companion, a puzzle. But afterward, something shifts. The child begins to understand that the image is not another. It is them. This milestone, known in psychology as the mirror self-recognition test, marks one of the earliest indicators of self-awareness. It is when the brain begins to form an internal map of identity, a sense of I am. And for many, it is a moment of wonder, of giggles, fascination, playful repetition. But for others, even among very young children, it is a moment of confusion, of hesitation, sometimes even of fear. The question arises, why should such a seemingly innocent revelation be unsettling? The answer lies in the delicate architecture of consciousness itself. To recognize one's reflection is to recognize separateness. It is to realize that one is not the same as the parent, or the caregiver, or the room. That one has a body, a face, a boundary. And while this may seem like a gentle developmental step, it also awakens a more primal awareness, that we are alone inside our skin, that we are observers of the world, not merged with it, that there is a line between self and other. And for a child, this realization, profound and sudden, can come like a shock. Some children recoil from the mirror once this recognition takes hold. They may grow quiet. They may look away. Others begin to fixate, returning again and again, seeking assurance, confirmation. Some sense that the face they see will remain the same. In these moments, the mirror becomes more than reflective glass. It becomes the first doorway into the inner world. In some studies, researchers noted that children raised in environments with fewer mirrors or reflective surfaces take longer to develop mirror recognition. And when it does occur, it sometimes comes with heightened emotion, surprise, delight, or distress. This suggests that the mirror is not merely a neutral tool for self-discovery, but an emotional experience in itself. Even in adulthood, echoes of this early encounter remain. We speak of losing ourselves, of finding ourselves, of looking ourselves in the eye. All of these expressions tie back, in some way, to that first mirror gaze, that moment when the self begins to form and begins to divide. For children especially, whose boundaries between reality and imagination are still soft and porous, the mirror can be a source of both comfort and anxiety. Some children speak of mirror people, imaginary companions who only exist in the reflection. Others become frightened at night, claiming they see things in the mirror that are not in the room, a flicker, a shadow, a face that doesn't belong. These experiences are often dismissed as overactive imagination, but they speak to something deeper, the lingering tension between recognition and uncertainty, between seeing oneself and seeing something else. In some cultures, stories of children and mirrors carry warnings. In part of Eastern Europe, old superstitions claim that children should not be allowed to gaze into mirrors before a certain age, lest they become mirror-touched, a condition described in folklore as a kind of spiritual disorientation. In such tales, the child becomes dreamy, distant, prone to staring for long hours without speaking. They claim they see others in the mirror, and often their reflection is said to change, smiling when they're sad, crying when they are still. Of course, in modern psychology, such behaviors are more likely attributed to sensory development, neurological variation, or emotional sensitivity. But the archetype remains, the idea that the mirror reveals something too much, too soon. Parents have noted that some children, even when too young to articulate fear, will cry in front of mirrors. Not always, not with every mirror, but in certain light or certain rooms or certain moods, the child grows anxious. They cling, they turn their face away. Perhaps the reflection is too unfamiliar. Perhaps it is too exact. In the quietest interpretations, some psychologists suggest that children, in their honesty, react not to what they see, but to what they feel. That mirrors, like music or voices, carry an emotional frequency, and that sometimes, especially in mirrors that have existed for generations, mirrors in old homes, heirlooms passed down, there is something in the glass that feels heavy, not haunted, not cursed, just full of history, of presence, of faces once gazed. And children, still close to the veil of unknowing, are sensitive to that weight. There are stories of twins who interact differently in mirrors, one approaching with joy, the other with suspicion, of toddlers who wave to the mirror version of themselves, then suddenly frown, confused, of preschoolers who insist that the mirror version said something different. These accounts are rare, but they persist. And so, the mirror becomes a quiet teacher. It shows us what we look like. It tells us who we are. But it also introduces the first subtle dissonance, the realization that we are watchable, that we are seen. And for some children, this becomes a lifelong echo, a hesitancy to face themselves, to meet their own gaze, to feel safe under observation. It is perhaps not fear of the mirror itself, but fear of what it reveals. A child, barely 2 years old, once pointed to her reflection and whispered, "She's not me." Her mother laughed it off, but the child would not approach the mirror again for weeks. In the quiet spaces of the modern world, between the hum of fluorescent lights and the buzz of electronic screens, there remains a curious paradox. Though we are surrounded by reflections, though cameras capture our faces hundreds of times a day, though front-facing phones have placed our own image into our palms, there are still those who feel a deep and private discomfort when standing before a traditional mirror, a reluctance to look, a quiet tension, and sometimes a lingering sense of fear. This fear is not always spoken. It is not always understood, but it exists in some cultures. It persists as open taboo. Among certain indigenous communities in North America and South America, there remain beliefs, carried quietly, respectfully across generations, that mirrors are thresholds, not simply tools, not mere household objects, but spiritual membranes that separate the physical from the unseen. In these traditions, one does not stare into a mirror without purpose. To gaze too long is to risk crossing. To seek something on the other side is to invite it into this one. Among the Roma people, some old stories still whisper that mirrors must be removed or turned after arguments, deaths, or illnesses, that the mirror, as silent witness, can trap negative energy, or worse, reflect it back into the home. In parts of East Africa, some elders caution against placing mirrors directly across from beds, believing they invite nightmares or allow spirits to pass through during sleep. In feng shui, the ancient Chinese art of arranging space for harmony, mirrors are powerful instruments, capable of multiplying energy, but also misdirecting it. A poorly placed mirror can create disharmony, attract misfortune, or reflect negative forces into a home. Even in highly modernized societies, these ideas persist beneath the surface. In Japan, where minimalism and interior reflection play important cultural roles, the presence of the mirror is treated with great care. Shinto tradition speaks of the Yada no Kagami, a sacred mirror that is one of the imperial regalia, said to represent wisdom and truth. To look into such a mirror is not a casual act. It is a spiritual one, a confrontation with purity. And though the average household mirror is not imbued with such status, the sense of quiet reverence lingers. But beyond cultural beliefs, there are more intimate, personal reasons why some avoid mirrors. Some individuals, many more than one might guess, have what psychologists call spectrophobia or mirror anxiety. They report feeling uneasy when looking into mirrors, even though they understand logically that there is nothing to fear. For some, it is rooted in trauma. Experiences with a mirror became associated with fear, violence, or grief. For others, it stems from dissociation, the feeling that the reflection is disconnected from the self, that the face they see does not belong to them. This is especially common in those who suffer from body dysmorphia, anxiety disorders, or certain types of depression. They describe moments when the mirror seems cruel, when it reflects not just a face, but every flaw, every memory, every failure. The mirror becomes an accusation, a silent critic, and so they avoid it not out of superstition, but out of pain. Still others speak of something more vague, a feeling that looking too long into their own eyes creates a sensation of vertigo, a dizziness of identity, that behind the eyes, something else is looking back. Psychologists have studied this phenomenon, and even have a name for one version of it: the strange face illusion. When a person stares into a mirror in low light for extended periods, more than a few minutes, their brain begins to alter the image. Faces blur, eyes seem to move, features warp. The mind, deprived of visual certainty, begins to fill in the gaps, and what it creates is often unsettling. Shadowy. Wrong. Some cultures have long known this instinctively. Stories from Slavic and Baltic regions speak of the mirror hour, the moment just before midnight when the boundary between the reflection and the real weakens. Children are warned not to look into mirrors at night, not to speak into them, not to test their courage by staring into candlelit glass, because something may answer, and it may not be kind. Even in Western childhood games, Bloody Mary, the Candy Man, these ancient taboos find modern expression. The mirror becomes a place of dare, of testing. Say the name, watch the reflection, wait. But beneath the laughter, there is a pulse of something older, a shiver of fear not fully understood. And in adulthood, it returns in subtle ways. The hotel room where the mirror is discreetly turned. The bathroom where someone wipes fog from the glass, only to hesitate before stepping into view. The moment, late at night, when a person walks past a dark mirror and quickens their pace, though nothing is moved. Why, then, does the mirror continue to unsettle? Perhaps because it reflects not just appearance, but awareness. It shows us our face, but also our hesitation, our aging, our history. It does not blink. It does not soften. It shows the self, stripped of distraction. And sometimes that is too much, because the mirror does not lie, but it does remember. It remembers how we looked before the sorrow, before the regret, before the change, and it reflects all of it back, gently, without commentary, without mercy. That is why, for some, it is easier not to look, to trust the face in memory, not the one in the glass, to see themselves through the eyes of others, or through the lens of time, because in the end, the mirror asks only one question: is this who you are? And for many, that is the hardest question of all. The mirror, for all its simplicity, remains one of the most complex objects in human experience. It is just glass, after all, flat, cold, and silent. It has no voice, no will, no secret machinery humming within it. And yet, for thousands of years, it has been feared, worshipped, avoided, covered, and stared into with longing or dread. Despite our science, despite our reason, despite our firm grip on reality, something in us continues to believe, quietly, deeply, privately, that the mirror is more than it seems. Even now, in a world bursting with screens, where our faces are captured and multiplied endlessly through cameras and devices, there's a difference between the fleeting image on a phone and the still, unblinking reflection in the mirror. One disappears. The other remains. One flatters or distorts. The other waits, watches, reflects. The mirror does not change us. It reveals us, and that, perhaps, is why the fear has never fully faded. Because we do change. Because the person we were last year or last week or even yesterday is no longer the same. And the mirror shows that change without hesitation, without kindness, without any of the softening that memory or others' eyes might offer. It is not that the mirror lies. It is that it tells the truth too plainly. When we look into the mirror, we are reminded not only of who we are, but who we used to be. The child now vanished. The lover now lost. The parent now gone. All of them once stood before the same pane of glass. All of them once blinked and smiled and passed on. And now we look alone. Perhaps that is why, in times of death, the mirror is covered, not out of superstition, but out of mercy. Because to look into it after loss is to face an unbearable silence, a shape once known that is no longer there, a reminder that time does not wait, that faces fade, that presence is temporary. Or perhaps the fear is deeper. Perhaps it is not the glass we fear, but what lies behind it. Because even now, even in the bright rational light of modernity, there are still stories, quiet, unsettling stories, of mirrors that moved, of reflections that smiled without cause, of figures that flickered in the corner of the glass. Not every story is true, but not every story needs to be. The fear is older than truth. It lives in the same quiet place as dreams and dusk and childhood memories that no longer have names. It comes not from evidence, but from instinct, from something in the animal part of the mind that once stared into a still pond at night and felt the hair rise along the neck. We have covered mirrors to hide from ghosts. We have avoided them to escape ourselves. We have feared them because they are still, because they see, because they remember, and because, in their depthless quiet, they sometimes seem to hold something more. A whisper, a shadow, a soul. And so, despite all we know, the fear remains. It lingers in the pause before we glance, in the tension before we meet our own gaze, in the strange sensation that we are not alone when we stand before the mirror in a darkened room. The fear of mirrors will never fully disappear, because the mirror does not simply reflect light. It reflects us, and we are always just a little afraid of being seen. You just listen to a quiet journey through history, belief, and the silent power of mirrors. If your eyes grow heavy now, let them close. Let the flickering images dissolve. Let the old stories drift into the night, like distant echoes of a world long past. You are safe. You are still, and the reflection sleeps too. If you found the story gentle and calming, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more sleepy tales still to come. Stories of old beliefs, forgotten people, quiet mysteries. Until then, sleep well, and may your dreams be kind. Good night.